Let's talk about partitions. Partitions are an interesting beast in Clarity. The idea of a partition is to enable different parts of an organization to see Clarity differently. A typical example, when I worked for CA, we had Chrysler as a client, and they were a huge Clarity installation, but they had Chrysler and Mercedes. I think one was owned by the other. I don't remember. I don't pay that much attention to cars. But the idea was that they had one Clarity installation. The Chrysler side of the company needed to see one view of projects, resources, etc., and the Mercedes side needed to see a completely different view. And they didn't want the two sides to intermingle in any way. So they set up a partition for Chrysler and a partition for Mercedes, and everything worked perfectly within the same system. And it looked like a totally different Clarity installation. And that's the idea. We explicitly avoided using partitions for a long time at AstraZeneca because they can get a little bit tricky. The other thing is partitions do not imply security. The idea of a partition is to give you a different view of the system, but it does not have any associated rights. So if you do manage to see something, you can view it, you can edit it, you can do whatever you want as long as you've got rights on the objects. The partition doesn't really matter as far as editing. So be very careful if you do go this route, not to assume that there are implied permissions. Let me give you a real quick example. On the development system, I worked with the UK operations group for a time. They disappeared somewhere and never came back, so I'm not sure what happened, but they were interested in using Clarity. But of course, their data is very different than IT. And because the existing AstraZeneca Clarity implementation is designed with IT in mind, it's extremely IT centric. So if I look at a project like my test project 4, the view of this project is, again, IT centric. So we're looking at things like the ITL team member and the set member and business architect and set IS contact. And these are all things that are pertinent to IS projects. Whether or not a RID is complete, technology dependencies, all of these are meaningless to somebody like UK operations. So in the dev environment, I did set up a separate partition so that if I look at a project like test 2, instead of all of these pieces of information, what I see in test 2 is a view designed specifically for UK ops. So the summary data is pretty much the same, but they had certain pieces of information that they want. They didn't have all that stakeholder stuff. This is what they needed. So by being able to set up multiple partitions, you can have multiple views of that same information. Now be aware, the underlying project is the same. It's not a different object, it's still the project object. Any attributes that are defined on the project object are available for every partition, but it's a matter of whether or not you choose to display them in a given partition definition. So let's look a little further at what goes on behind the scenes in order to do this. The first place to look is under Administration Studio Partition Models. You can have multiple partition models, and each model has multiple partitions, so it has a hierarchical structure. Think of it in terms of an organizational breakdown structure. You can define multiple OBSs. Each OBS model has its own hierarchy, its own structure, and the same is true with partitions. So currently we have a number of them defined. Most of these are either legacy or out-of-the-box things that we chose not to use, or in one case it's a result of my own misunderstanding of partitions about 5 years ago. So what we have now is currently only one active partition, which is the AZ primary AstraZeneca partition model. So if I drill into that one, then I can see what all of my associated objects are. Now again, partitions are designed to give you differing views of an object. You can't partition something like the home screen, you can't partition a portlet, you can only apply partitions to the views on an object. So when you have a partition model, you can choose which objects you're going to associate with that model. and you can see these are the ones associated with our only partition. The Partitions tab lets you see the hierarchy. So this is the structure. Right now it's extremely simple. We have a system at the top, which is always going to be there. Then we have AstraZeneca and we have UK operations. If you're setting up a brand new model from scratch, I strongly recommend that you always put your primary intended use of the system below the system partition. There's a tendency in some cases for people to put everything, all of their definitions at the system level. But it's best, even though you may only have one partition, as you would, put it underneath system and make it subservient, because that enables you to, down the road, decide that, oh, we need another one. If you put all of your primary stuff at the top level and don't have any lower levels, then if you decide you need something different, your only choice is to make it a subpartition of the top one, and that doesn't work too well. So in this case, that's what I did when we first set up this system years ago. I created the AstraZeneca partition underneath system. So then when UK operations said, well, we need our own stuff, it was very simple to just click new, create a new partition under system in parallel with AstraZeneca, and that keeps them completely distinct and separate. So that's all there is to it in terms of setting up a specific model. This is just properties, and then you can look here and see who has access to the partition, which I'll get to shortly. The other thing to note is the UI theme. If you want clarity to appear differently, like this is our dev environment, it's in black and white. So you can go to the administration menu, you can go to UI themes, you can change the UI theme to black and white, but it's still going to show up in the default colors unless you also change the partition. So partitions apply to people and they apply to objects. So as a user, if I am in the AstraZeneca partition on this dev environment, I'm going to see the selected black and white UI theme. If I'm a user in a different partition, I might see a different theme that's associated with that partition, even though the UI themes under the admin module may say something else. So it's a little bit tricky, but the bottom line is if you want your UI themes to show up the way you expect, you got to change it here, and you have to change it under the partition properties. Okay, so that's how we set up a partition. We can define lower levels, but I strongly recommend that you keep it very simple. So right now we've just got AstraZeneca, and then we've got UK operations. Where this comes into play is when you drill into an object. So if I go over here to the objects, administration objects, and I've done a filter for SER, if I look at my service enhancement request object, this is a custom object that we built for AZ, and it is a master object. There is no partition model. So everybody gets the same view of a service enhancement request. But if I go to a project, and I've got a shortcut into the Studio project object, you can see that the project is associated with the AstraZeneca partition. So that enables me to go to views and associate either of the levels within that model. Now it's important not to get confused here, and this is a little bit confusing. This is the partition model. This is not the partition element. So if again I look back at my partition models, the name of the model is AstraZeneca, and one of the nodes in there is AstraZeneca. So you do have, that's probably poor planning on my part, but when you look at the partition model, this AstraZeneca refers to the model name, not to this name. Okay, so within that model, as we can see here, within the partition model of AstraZeneca, we've got system, we've got AstraZeneca, which really should say AstraZeneca IT, and UK operations. And in fact, that's not a bad idea. I'm going to change that. Whoever's watching this might want to change it in production. That's better. Now, if I go back here, this is still going to say AstraZeneca, even if I refresh, because it's the name of the model. But when I go to views on the project, Now I've got a system drop or a partition drop down up here, which you don't have on a server because it's not partitioned. And underneath that, I've got AstraZeneca IT and UK operations. So when you're changing the view of the screen, if you want to change the screen layout for projects, you need to make very sure that you're looking at the right partition when you make changes. Otherwise, you make changes and then you look at the project screen and you don't see your changes. So if I drill into AstraZeneca IT partition, and whenever you change this, the screen blips, but it's easy to miss. So I always watch for the refresh circle over there, right there, and wait till it stops. Now I know that I'm looking at the right partition. So let's just stay on UK Ops. If I go to Layout Edit on the project properties under UK Operations partition, and again, you can see that up there to make sure that you're in the right place. If I now look at my project summary page, drill into that, I can click. Now I see the layout that we saw earlier when we looked at a UK Ops project, my test 4 project. But if I go back and change the view to AstraZeneca IT, now if I look at my layout edit and I look at my project summary page, and notice I've got a whole different set of subpages here. I'm not clicking well today. There we go. Now I see my header details stakeholders that are associated with an IT project. So that's the basic idea of using partitions. Now the only other gotcha with partitions comes when you're looking at a lookup. So if I go into a lookup and I want one that is I don't care about user defined, I want a static list. So let me look at something like this. When I go to the values of this, you need to make sure that you look at the right partition. If you define values in a lookup within an AstraZeneca IT partition, then those values won't show up in the drop-down list or the browse window when your project is associated with a different partition. So I routinely define values to be in the system partition. It defaults, if I click new, to the IT partition. So I always change that to system before I define a new value. That way, whatever value I'm defining is available for both the IT and the UK Ops partition. Now, that may not always be pertinent, but I've always done it that way before well, and in production, we only have one partition. So that way I'm sure that those values are always going to show up. But you do have to be careful. The other thing is if you have projects that suddenly show up as being in the system partition, they're going to look weird and you're going to have some difficulty. So one of the things that you can do is you can go to your project list page and you can configure it to include partition. And this is taking forever and I'm almost out of time. And I did not do that. But if you include partition as one of the columns, then you can see at a glance which partition your projects are in. You can filter on that column and look for ones that aren't where they belong. And then you can go in and manually correct them. So that's a quick overview of partitions. Hopefully that made sense. And now that you understand them, you rock.